Catherine, welcome to the Tales of Leadership podcast. I'm humbled to have you on. How are you doing?
Oh my goodness, it's so lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm excited to chat with you today and be here with your audience as well, get to meet them. I feel like even though we do everything virtually, it does feel like that connection crosses the airwaves. So I love to be in conversation with you and with all of your listeners.
Yeah, I can already tell the conversation that we had beforehand, like going on a phone conversation, and then now you have a very calm voice. So I think that that's going to be a refreshing because most of the people that I have on, Tales of Leadership podcast have a very militaristic tone about them. I don't know how I come off, but just hearing you talk, I think it's going to be a refreshing tone. Maybe you could start off with providing just an overview to our listeners of who you are and what you do.
Just a small question.
Yeah, just a tiny question.
That's so good. And thank you for what you said about my voice. I've also been told that I put people to sleep with my
Mm,
voice. And so, you know what? I'm going to count that as a success. If anyone falls asleep, you probably needed some rest. So there we go.
I love it.
And that's a good segue into, I guess, who I am and what I do in this world. I am a meditation teacher and a stress coach and a relaxation guide. And I came into this work not because I myself am a naturally calm, patient, relaxed person, quite the opposite. I actually came into this work as a second career. I
Mm.
started my professional life as a corporate litigator. So, you should be glad that you're not hearing my lawyer voice because that's a scarier one for sure. And I left corporate law 9 years ago, really to solve my own stress problem. And then, by way of doing that, started to teach and share this work with others and haven't looked back since. So,
Mm. There's going to be so much goodness, I think, to get into that journey of how you went from being a corporate lawyer into mindfulness coaching and then kind of where you are right now. But I always love starting off the conversation with the same, just simple definition because we all have different
mm,
definitions of leadership.
mhm.
But I want to hear, what is Catherine's definition of leadership? How do you define it?
Oh my goodness, another small question. I believe that everyone is a leader, and I think
Mm,
many of us don't claim that for ourselves, but it's true. I think you are a leader anytime you walk into a room, anytime you share space with others. And it's not just what you say, it's how you make people feel, it's the space that you create. Um, every time we interact with others, we have the ability to show up as a leader, to show up and just change the air in the room. I mean, we know what that feels like. I think
yeah.
about this a lot in the context of my work, which is working with individuals and talking about their own stress levels and their own nervous systems. I always say every collective has a nervous system. Like your office has an organizational nervous system, your family does, your neighborhood, your community. And so, just by showing up in those spaces and shifting our energy with our mere presence, that to me is like the essence of leadership.
Mm.
Yeah.
You said something that I already really like, and it's they change the air. So
Yeah.
leaders have the ability to change the air, and it's so true. If you've ever, and I know you coming from the corporate world, corporate legal, there's definitely a different atmosphere when you're at work versus like being in the military. Probably the same. You have a different heavy atmosphere. But if you
Mhm.
go into for example, I just went out for a couple months ago to one of my vendors that I work for in my current program, and they were on the West Coast, very creative, very intuitive company, so totally different vibe
Mhm.
within work.
Mhm.
But it all comes down to the leader and the culture that they
Yeah.
set within that organization. What type of environment do you want to establish within your life? Which I think
Mhm.
is important because you said another amazing thing, and I love your definition of leadership is that we are all leaders, and
Mhm.
you're a leader of yourself first, and
Yeah.
that's a very important note. So already starting off with some really good nuggets. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And I think, we've talked about this in our earlier conversations. We're both parents. And I think
Yeah.
that's such a great example of like the essence of leadership because it's not just about what you say,
Mm,
right? And you know that being a parent, you're like,
yeah.
your kids know when you are saying one thing and you mean another. Like they
Yeah.
just see through all of it. And I think we all have that ability. We just sometimes lose it as we get older, but it still matters. It still counts. Your actions have to match what you're saying. And I think
Mm.
that's also a big part of leadership.
Deeds and words. For a long time, I always said
Mm,
deeds, not words, but you have to be able to align deeds and words. And just a quick story because you're so true with parents.
yeah,
We're
tell me.
trying to break the habit of having my children eat in front of the TV.
Yeah.
So they eat in the dining room. Well, then yesterday I caught myself breaking the rule. I was like, "Oh, I'm just gonna go eat in front of the TV with my kids, and it'll be okay." And then my daughter, which is very cerebral, an
Mm.
intelligent young lady, s- Dad, you're breaking the rule. It's like, "Oh, okay, yeah, you're right. I am. I'm breaking the rule."
That's right. Oh my gosh, that makes me think of all the things, like, we could have a whole episode on parenting and
Yeah.
screens. I love that. Another thing it makes me think of is, like, um, leaders also need to know you need to know what the rules are and when and how to
Mm,
break them, and also to own when you're not in alignment with breaking them at the right times. And then the other thing that this makes me really think about when it comes to the definition of leadership and what is a leader and how do we lead, it's like the word I would use to describe what I said before is embodiment.
mm,
Like it's like, integrated through your whole being. So it is your
yeah.
deeds, it is your words, it is your thoughts even. I mean, yeah.
I so that kinda reminded me of a whole concept when I was going through my leadership coaching that I didn't really understand beforehand. We always have a
Mm,
leadership philosophy. Whenever we go
uh-huh.
into an organization, you wanna have a leadership philosophy, but most of the times, I feel that leaders nowadays that are leading organizations or large teams, that leadership philosophy is just words on a paper. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean anything. So we were going through an exercise with J.R. Flatter, and I use it a lot, in the podcast and the coaching. It's called a house of leadership. So what
Mm,
is your metaphorical house of leadership? What's the base foundation that you lead yourself and others with? What are your four walls of how you would build that leadership? What are the pillars and the components, the core values that you hold near and dear to you, and then the roof of that? And if you can build your house of leadership and it's right on the right foundation, it kind of goes to what you were just saying. When you're placed in an ethical or a moral issue of where, hey, should I go by the book on this or should I follow my gut?
mhm.
Then when you have your core values and you know who you are, you can do that much easier versus if you don't know who you are, truly who you are, you kind of hesitate, I believe, in those moments.
Yeah, I love everything you're saying, and it's like it's so both and. We
Yeah.
absolutely need to understand, like, what our theoretical take on things is, but if we only live in that space, we're not really leading. It's again like parenting. I use parenting as a metaphor for so much because it's like nothing is
The
theoretical,
world's
nothing
best
is
leadership
hypothetical.
challenge.
Right. You're living, It's like it has to
Mm,
be happening in real time. These lessons don't just live on like a placard on your wall. It's like it comes to every decision making moment, even as simple and mundane as like, where are we eating dinner tonight,
yeah.
kids?
Yeah.
And
And I
that's the
love it.
other thing. Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Now, I was going to say I could see some of the art on the background too. Usually I have some of my daughter's art back there. But
Yeah.
yeah, that it's so yeah. What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
I don't remember, but it wasn't that important. It'll come back to me. Something about, yeah, it'll come. It'll come. It's not theoretical. It's got to be lived. And oh, this is like to kind of pull all the threads we're weaving together back into the same tapestry. Like some
Mm,
people look on the outside at the decisions that I've made in my career, like corporate litigator, very much beginning my professional life in this adversarial, high stress, fast paced, high stakes environment, and then like leaving to teach meditation. I mean, those things seem quite different, but there's so many there's so many roots of my work
Yeah.
now that come from my training as a lawyer. And one of the biggest things that you move, one of the biggest distinguishing factors of how things are organized as a lawyer and in law school is that you learn substantive law, like
Mm,
property law, tort law, contract law, and then you learn procedural law, like civil procedure. How do you take this law through a civil litigation, criminal procedure? How does that work? And it's always both. You need to know the meat of what it is, and then you need to know the how of how it comes
mm.
to life. Yeah.
Oh, we haven't even gotten like 10 minutes in this episode. I haven't got to any of the questions I want to ask you, but then that also reminds me of another thing. So my definition of leadership is to inspire. And I think that it takes four key characteristics. You have to be proficient, you have to have a strong reputation, you have to produce output. So pro. And I'm a
Mm.
pro at creating acronyms. And you'll learn this about me, Catherine. I'm
Mm.
really good at just making acronyms. But I think part of being proficient and what you just said is understanding the tools that you have
Mhm.
at your disposal and then how to maneuver those tools in real life. And that is where the art and the science of leadership come together. How do you take those tools and then how do you maneuver them to achieve the desired effects in either your life and the organization, the team that you lead? And that is where I believe separates ordinary from extraordinary. It's that little bit extra, how John Maxwell always says, just that extra little bit of effort of taking the tool, the practical academic knowledge, and then
Mhm.
applying it to the real world, but not applying it by the book, applying it to your situation. And I think that takes courage to do.
Mm. I love that. I love your acronyms. I want to learn them all. That's so helpful. That's such a good teaching tool. It's so nice to be able to distill something down into the rememberable essence of the thing. That's great.
I love how humble you put that because I like to think that I'm an infantryman, so I follow the rule of KISS, keep it simple, stupid. So if I can
Simple
remember it, everyone else will, right? Um,
Oh,
so
so much there. That's so good. Yes.
walk me on your journey because I want to know what inspired you to go into corporate law, and
Mm.
there's some lessons I believe that can be learned there, especially then the pivot of why you decided to leave.
Yeah. You know, I've said this before, and so far I'll stick to it because it remains the truth for me, is that I was as sure about my decision to go to law school and to become a lawyer as I was in my decision to leave.
Mm,
But I would say the surety of those decisions came from two different sources. And my decision to go to law school was very much driven by a kind of natural set of talents and proclivity toward the ability to do this kind of work. I mean,
mm.
we naturally kind of navigate and are guided towards things that we can do, we're good at, we can
Yeah.
make it work. But that's not the only criterion of like choosing your work in the world, right? We forget that. So I think I had like a natural ability. And then as we grow up, we start to receive these signs of external validation and, go walking the very straight and narrow linear path of always doing the next right thing that took me to law school and to big law was
Yeah.
like just I mean, all the road signs I had were the nods of approval and, oh, that's very good job. And that's very impressive. And I mean, you just pick up these signs that you're doing the right thing in other people's eyes. And so I felt sure that I was making the right decisions. Everyone around me was confirming that for me.
Yeah.
But then my decision to leave was so sure, but it came from a totally inside place. I mean, you better believe it that when I told my parents, I told the partners I worked for, my colleagues, like a one half of the reaction was like, "Are you kidding me?"
Mm.
So I better, have known from the inside out that that was the right decision for me because half the people around me thought I was nuts, you know?
How did you realize that that was the right decision for you? Because that's a hard decision. I put myself in some of my friends' shoes that I thought was, going to go well above me in my military career. but they chose to get out. And a similar
Mhm.
path is that when we walk this linear path, being in the military, there's a rank structure to it. There's a very
Right.
linear path for us to be successful. But when we deviate from that, like you just said, people are like, why are you doing that? And I have
Mhm.
a buddy of mine right now. He turned down CSL for lieutenant colonel, which essentially means he ended his career, 20,
Mhm.
22 years in. He ended his career because he chose to take a job that he was deeply passionate about versus going and doing a job that he could have done, but he has no alignment there between the head and the heart. And
Mhm.
that takes courage. How
Mm.
did you work through that?
Mm. Well, I have to put myself back in those shoes, which were very different shoes than the ones I wear now.
Yeah.
I knew my husband. We were just kind of getting together at this juncture. I was in my late 20s. I
Mm.
didn't have children. Like, I was making that decision for me. And I didn't have this like larger kind of decision making structure that I have now almost 10 years later, which is
Oh,
like
wow.
needing to make decisions that are the best for not only me but my family. So I just to
Yeah.
kind of it didn't feel as courageous to me then because it was just me, It was like I could do this. And so that's like some context I feel like. But how did I get to that place of knowing there's this wonderful book, and I am such a student as much as I am a teacher, and I learned
Mm.
so much from books. And there's this beautiful book. It's written by this man named Parker Palmer, and he's an educator, and he's an activist, and he's a leader, and he's in his 80s, which like I just love. I really love learning from people who have decades of experience and wisdom to share with me. And this book is called Let Your Life Speak. And the premise of this book, and it comes from a philosophy that I think is pretty ingrained in Quakerism, which is his
Mm.
faith background. And it's like we go around telling our life what we think it should be, right? We're like, this is what I want out of this experience. This is what I think it will look like in the end. And this is what I'm good at liberal arts history and arguing I should be a
Mm.
lawyer, right? Like we're telling our life how it should come out.
Yeah.
And letting your life speak requires listening to what your life actually wants from you. And the distilled essence of that he talks about is your vocation. It's a calling. This is from the Latin root word that means to call. And so, in order to live a life and make choices that align with your vocation and not like an external definition of success, you have to listen.
Mm.
Yeah, to yourself and get really quiet and spend a long time listening. And that was really what I was doing in the years leading up to leaving was listening.
Wow. Yeah, I'm kind of reflecting on, I think we all have our own religious backgrounds, right? And I never try to push mine on anyone, but I was attending a church this weekend and they broke down, the passage of John chapter 3. Yeah, it took it through verse 1 through 18. But what you just said, I think summed it up beautifully, is that whole passage is about being born again. You
Mm,
can be born again in your life and reinvent yourself. The labels that other people give you aren't necessarily the labels that have to define you for the rest of your life. You can follow your passion, you can follow your purpose, and that's so true. What you just said is the secret to that. And I'm
mm,
starting to discover that now is slowly silencing your mind and spending time to think.
yeah,
And that's hard to do. It's hard to sit down and to journal and to think through a complex problem, but when you can do that, it just flows. It just
yeah.
flows out of you.
Yes, and I was just thinking about what you were saying about being reborn and coming back to our earlier kind of nods to this idea of like a straight linear path. I mean,
Yeah.
we are so Oh, we are dear, tender, fragile human beings who also have a lot of arrogance in thinking that even
Mm,
though the entire natural world around us shows us that we exist in cycles, that growth is not linear. I mean, I'm
yeah.
looking outside my window right now. We have a snowstorm coming later today, and yet the buds, the earliest buds of spring are shooting
Yeah.
up. It's like these cycles are all around us, and we think, oh, that's not for me. I can just go straight forward really fast for the
Mm,
rest of my life on this
yeah.
one track, come on.
And then burnout. If you do
Burnout.
that, it leads to burnout. I've seen so many peers of mine that just go nonstop, 100
Yeah,
miles an hour. And then 20 years in, yeah, they're successful,
right.
but they have no balance in their life. And I guess balance for me is I don't necessarily like the word balance
Me
because I
neither.
believe that yeah, okay, perfect. Because we're chasing that moment in time and it only comes in a fleeting. But if you can chase harmony and just be okay and
Mm,
acceptance of where you are within your life, maybe you need to spend more time with your family. Maybe you have to spend more time at work to get through that season, which what you
mhm.
just said. And I feel like we're on the same
Right.
wavelength, which I love. And I'm also kind of depressed that I wish I had snow. It's actually a nice spring day here.
Yeah.
But I think that is the key is that you have to be okay with the changing of seasons and not trying to force a plan because
Yeah.
when we fight the plan we lose the battle, and it's the same when we go into me putting my military hat on. I can create the perfect plan in the world, but
Right.
once I get into contact with the enemy life, it's going to change, and I have to
Mhm.
be okay to allow that to change and not try to force it, because when you force it then it just leads to burnout.
Yes, I love, I mean, my working definition of burnout is like continually asking yourself to give what you no longer have left to
Mm,
give. Like you can, you're running on fumes, right? Running on fumes, and then we take better care of our cars, right? We allow
yeah.
ourselves to run on fumes, and then we like get shocked when we break down,
Yeah.
when we're on the side of the road, we can't go any further. And balance, oh my goodness. I mean, my podcast is called Beyond Balance, and it's really came from this place of like, yes, it's this ever elusive myth we're always chasing that puts so
Yeah.
much pressure on us that we'll never get to. And I love what you said, harmony. For me, I think the word I use that lies beyond balance is wholeness.
Mm, wholeness. I
Hmm.
like that too.
Yeah, and balance to me, it's very adversarial. If you're trying to
Agree.
find balance, you've got the two sides of the scale and you're putting some things over here and some things over here. And when you separate out the elements of your life, like they're constantly going to be at war, right?
Yeah.
And also
Yeah.
not everything can be weighed and numbered and put on a spreadsheet or tracked with an app in terms of metrics. And like I think balance leaves all of that texture and nuance of a whole life out of it.
And that leads to a question that I wrote down that I've been wanting to ask you is how do you have such a deep level of acceptance? And what you just said too, understanding that everything in life can't be measured. How did
Mhm.
you develop that mindset? Because I'm thinking of you, pre where you are now, but with wearing a lawyer hat, knowing a lot
Mhm.
of the lawyers that I've had, and that's I don't know, maybe I'm making an early I guess that maybe you weren't like that before, but I'm assuming that was a
Mm.
major mindset change, from most of the lawyers I know of where you are now with I don't know if you've ever read the book David Hawkins, the level of consciousness. I
No,
think
but
you're
I
much higher on that map of
mm,
consciousness of versus probably where you were with the lawyer, and how did you kind of develop that deep level of acceptance?
that's really sweet. I mean, of course, like catch me in a moment with both of my kids melting down in the
Yeah.
kitchen. It's like, nope, never mind. And my husband always does that. Like we'll all be freaking out and he'll be like, gosh, I really wish we knew a stress expert right about now. And I'm like, touche, honey, touche. Yeah. So, and that's the other thing too, is I always have to share. Um, and I do this with my clients and my students and on my podcast. Like, I'm never going to pretend like I have any of this figured out. I just
Yeah.
share from a place of integration that's a few steps further down my own path, and
Mm.
that's what I offer. But, you know, again, I'm coming back to books that help me understand this journey, and I just finished this wonderful book, Falling Upward: Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life. Have you read this? Did we talk about this?
It is on my so I'm just like you, but I'm a
Uh-huh.
slow reader. As I
Mm,
want to read so many books a year, but I do it so slowly that I like to journal through it. That is on
mhm.
my books for this year that I want to read.
It's so good. And Richard Rohr talks about in that book that there are two halves of life, and we are very much a first half of life culture. And that's where
Mm,
things line up like good, bad,
mm,
right or wrong, metrics, trackable, spreadsheet, all that kind of like you win or you lose. And we need that. It's an organizing principle for creating a life, building a life. He calls that the foundation of life. But he says so many of us don't realize that there's the whole rest of the house to build. And so, if we allow ourselves to get to the further journey of life, which is where we have an understanding that things are not so black and white, that we could appreciate that, growth and change could look like this cyclicality of seasons and not like just getting further up the ladder. Like that's second half of life stuff. And it can be chronological. It's not that way for everyone. Some people never get there. And it's not that you leave behind the first half of life stuff. You just take it with you as you move. So both can be
mm,
true. I
yeah.
mean, like, first half of life stuff is great. It's like, okay, taxes are due this day. These are the rules. Stop at red, go on green. Of course, we need that stuff.
Mm.
Hmm.
So that made me think of kind of putting it through the military lens. Every operation you ever go on, there's a decisive point. It's a
Yeah.
moment in time of where you have either gained enough combat power on the objective or you have enough overwhelming force that the end state is certain. And
Hmm.
once that decisive point is achieved, then effectively you've won that battle. And what you just said, I don't think I've ever thought of it like that, is that we are always focused on the first half of our life. But there's a decisive point there, and I think we always, I guess it's labeled now as what is it, midlife crisis that everyone kind
Yeah.
of goes through. I think that's the
Yeah.
decisive point in people's lives of being able to shift from that first half of life being focused on metrics. Where did I get my graduate degree?
Hmm.
Where do I go to work next? How much do I make? Do I have all the fancy cars? Do I have all these things that society says that I need to be happy? And then you find yourself in that decisive point in your life. I'm not happy. Maybe
Yeah.
I have those things. And then you have to have a deep level of acceptance kind of going into the second half. I never thought about that until you just said that. That's amazing.
Well, when you get to Richard Rohr's book, when you get there later this year, you'll see it and let me know because it's just, and David White is another great writer who talks about this stuff. So many, but for me
Mm,
too, and this comes back to your first question of like, so how did you make that mindset set shift? I mean, it was always evolving. I
mm,
remember being um, I remember writing down like little scratch notes to myself in that year leading up to this decision to leave. And it took about a year of planning and all of that because, that's the first half of life stuff, how to figure
yeah.
out those logistics. But I remember like writing down lines from the Sufi poet Rumi, 13th
Mm,
century Sufi poet Rumi, my notebook that had my letterhead, like my name and my fancy law firm on it. Like I would just be scratch writing these notes to myself. And one of them is out beyond right doing and wrongdoing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And it's just
mm,
this, and it's another encapsulation of this idea that yes, there is this binary world in some ways where there's rules and you can break them or you can not, or you could follow them, but there's so much more. And so I think I always had both tracks going. It was just what was I feeding more at the time? And
mm,
to get to law school and to get through the bar and to get into my law firm, I was very much feeding that kind of like the mindset that kept me right in that, yep, check the next right box. Yep, achieve the next thing, collect the
yeah.
next line for your resume. And I was also feeding the other, part of me too. It just that balance shifted. My nourishment started coming more from that other, you know, non linear, non-binary place at a certain point.
So walk me through, the moment you decided to take a chance, as
Mhm.
one of my mentors, Jared Flatter, would say, jump off the 10-meter tower and go
Mhm.
into kind of this entrepreneurial space. How did you discover your passion and your purpose? When was that spark that
Yeah.
this
Well,
is it?
I don't think it was a slow burn, and that that's kind of along the lines of what I was saying. The two tracks were always playing out for me. So when I was a kid, when I was in high school, and this is like the late 90s, and the world looked different, but I
Yeah.
hated gym class. And so my teacher, the gym teacher, like, remember they used to wheel out, you might be younger than I, but they used to wheel out TVs on these like metal frames, and
I
they were
know
like the
exactly what you're
big
talking
boxy
about.
TVs,
Yep.
right? It'd go from like
Yeah.
the history room to the gym room. And
Yeah.
so she wheeled that in, and they put on a yoga VHS tape. And so if we didn't
Oh,
want to
wow.
play dodgeball, we could go and do this video. And so I kind of found the practice of yoga there. And it was something that I kept going all through college. And when I got to law school, it was like my lifeline. It was the way I stayed
Mm,
sane and kept myself, it found that the wholeness. At that time, I probably would have called it balance, to not burn
yeah.
out. And then, the meditation piece of it is like, meditation is paying attention, right? It's paying attention and sitting in that space of inquiry and self-understanding. And it's funny, that's the Socratic method, right? Socrates said, know thyself. And that's how we teach law school, is asking
Mm,
questions. So I've always cared about the questions, and I've always been parallel tracking these two parts of me. But I think at some point, the kind of, I guess the spark, if there was one, was this moment about 3 years into practicing law where, like, I had a case that settled. I had a bad breakup. And these are the, like, you got to go through these thresholds to kind of get to that
yeah.
decision point.
Yeah.
Stuff needs to fall, things need to fall apart, as Pema Chodron says. Like, and I just looked up for the first time because my nose was so glued to the paper and the grindstone. I just looked up, and I looked around, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I want this for me.
Wow.
And I didn't. And this is the thing about listening to your life, is that so often the answers are going to annoy you. They're going
Yeah.
to frustrate you. You're going to be like, are you kidding me? I have this job security. I have make all this money. I have these great degrees. Everyone's so proud of me. And this is what my life is telling me, that I don't belong here, that the world actually didn't need me to be another corporate litigator. What now? Like, that was not what I wanted to
Wow.
hear on the one hand.
That's such an amazing story, though. So walk me through kind of, you know, some of the most impactful lessons that you took from being a corporate litigator into kind of pursuing this space of being a mindful coach. What lessons were you able to pull upon that helped you through challenging times?
Well, I think this comes back to the beginning of our conversation about leadership and how it's not just theoretical.
Mm,
Like, I left my firm. I was living in Washington, D.C. I moved to Washington, D.C. from Philadelphia to work at this law firm. And I stayed in Washington, D.C. when I left and began teaching meditation and restorative yoga in Washington, D.C., which is like kind of like selling hot dogs at the baseball stadium, right? Like, everyone is stressed.
yeah,
Everyone was a corporate
everyone.
litigator, or worked on the Hill, or worked in the military, like, or worked for the State Department, or I mean, this is like a high stress, fast paced, high stakes city. And so to start offering work that gave people relief and respite and restoration from that, like, hard edge of stress, was just such
Mm,
a natural progression. So it's almost like this vocational work of just creating and holding space for myself and others to be, that kind of, it just started flowing. And I think a lot
wow.
of it had to do with where I was and how people could relate to my story in a town like DC. I had people walk in off the streets. Oh, you're the lawyer. You're the lawyer. You get this, you
Mm,
get what it feels like to have a fire drill land on your desk on a Friday at 5 p.m. and have it blow up your whole weekend.
No. That's happened so many times.
Yeah. And so I think that it made my life or it made my work so much richer, my own lived experience. And this is what I always say, not like I'm claiming any kind of wisdom for myself, but like information or knowledge is great, but it's not until you pair it with experience that you can ever alchemize that into wisdom,
Yep.
or leadership or whatever you want to call it, something to share.
So many things there. And there was one thing that you said. So Aristotle is a great quote that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. It all
Mm,
starts with us. We have to know who we are. But then you just talked about something, I call it the rule of traction.
mm,
And this is so oftentimes people want to avoid creating resistance within their life. Resistance is required for change because when we can create resistance, what does it do? It creates traction, and traction is required for momentum. But when we gain momentum, exactly what you were doing in DC with all of these individuals, it turned into a ripple effect of where you had enough momentum gained. It didn't matter what kind of obstacle that you were going to encounter. And in the military, there's 4 types of obstacles: block, turn, fix, or disrupt. 3 of those
mm,
types are easily maneuvered around. And that is the key to gain momentum. So life, when it does create more friction in your life, you can just easily blow through that. And I think that's a beautiful example of what you just said. When you can connect your passion and your purpose in life, people will naturally just gravitate towards you. But be okay in that space of creating traction and resistance in your life, because that is where the experience, and that was another amazing thing you said, the experience and the education come from. Maybe you are educated in something. Well, you have to go through that experience to truly understand it. You can teach me something and then I can read it, but I have to go do it. I have to
mhm,
actually be able to apply it. In the military, we have it. It's called crawl, walk, run.
mm,
Crawl, show me. Walk, let me do it. Run, let me do it and fail, because then I'll learn.
mm.
So when I actually need to do that thing, I won't fail. Then that's an amazing example.
I love everything you're teaching me about the military. This is fascinating for me too. Thank you. It's so good. I love learning. So, so good. Yeah, I love that you call it like traction or friction. I think of tension as well, like that,
Mm,
and that is such a necessary part of like that creative tension to be able to kind of move through something
yeah,
and get to wherever you're going next. Yeah, that's necessary, but it's so uncomfortable and
it
we
is.
don't like it at all.
I had a guest on, Jason Van Camp. He's the author of, I'm probably going to totally mess this up. Um, I think deliberate discomfort. I'll
Mm,
have to look it up and just make sure. But he talks about the concept that when we embrace that place of being uncomfortable, that is where we truly grow. And it's so key is that people will seek out all these endurance races and these uncomfortable situations, because that's where we grow. And the same is true in life. Whatever you want to achieve in, if you want to achieve success, you have to be able to put yourself in those points of where friction's naturally going to occur, because that's
mhm,
where the growth happens. And
that's right.
so walk me through, where you are currently right now. What is your mission?
Mm. Well, I'm on a mission to put the tools of immediate stress relief in as many hands as possible. That's the
Mm,
first part of the mission. Because here's the thing about stress, like, it is a real physiological experience we're having in our bodies. It impacts our health, our well-being, our sense of self, our decisions. It sucks, right? Chronic and unmanaged, unmitigated acute stress is killing us as a society. So it's like
yeah.
to put those tools in people's hands is like the first part of the mission. And then the second part is okay, once we get back to like a reclamation of our optimal zone of homeostasis in our nervous systems, like then the real work can start. And for me, the second part of that is not only helping people deal with their stress, but helping people start their own mini stress culture
Mm,
revolutions, which is really like, I think that I always knew I left Big Law because I didn't, the high stress was getting to me. But it wasn't just that, it was the culture created around glorifying stress and the
mm,
characteristics of fight, flight, or freeze. I'm talking hustle culture. I'm talking always rushing. I'm talking, grit your teeth and work harder, sleep when you're dead, not when you're done. Like,
yeah,
I mean, this is like where so much lives. And so I meet people at the point of stress because we're all talking about it. We all know what it is.
yeah,
And so for me, it's like, I think about like living a life of high stress and living in stress culture and subscribing to it in all of your daily doings feels like you're living in like this really cramped room.
mm,
And then being able to work with your stress, and the tool that I use for that is meditation and mindfulness. That's like the door wedge, right? It just like wedges the door of this cramped stress room open enough to see
yeah,
that everything is outside,
yeah.
right? Everything. And so, yeah, it's a very kind of easy, mild, low key mission that I'm on.
Well, it's an inspiring mission going back to my definition of leadership. It's just creating a little bit of light in someone's
Mhm.
life to inspire them enough to go seek change. And so could you walk me through what is hustle culture, like how you define it? I think the
Mm.
stress culture.
Mhm, mhm. So, this is like what I'm working on right now is trying to kind of put language to all of this. But the way I see it is that when we're in fight, flight, or freeze, right? Like think of actually what's happening. Like we go faster, we lift more, we push harder. Like all of
Yeah.
these things are survival mechanisms. But when so many of us are stuck in a chronic state of stress,
Mm,
then all of these characteristics get solidified and glorified into values and norms. So we expect to be rushing, right?
mm,
We expect to be multitasking. We expect to be always available. We expect to always be able to make the Herculean effort required to like put out the fire, even if it's not required. And it means that a lot of us are burnout and going really fast and juggling a
yeah.
ton of balls and feeling like there is no other way. But our stress response is a survival mechanism. And that means that a lot of us are living in survival mode. Right.
Yeah. Mm. So I know
And
you're working. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, I mean, we're talking mid-March right now. It's the 3-year anniversary of a lot of us getting flipped into survival mode, and, I think a lot of us are
Yeah.
still carrying a lot of that chronic stress around, not processing it. It's still a heavy moment, and the thing about stress is that, you know, it's not all bad. And you
Mm,
can't make it go away. We need stress, right? In the
yes.
right amounts, at the right times, in the right instances. You know this in the military,
Yeah.
right? But we also need to know how to override unnecessary stress responses, how to heal from the physiological effects of stress in our bodies. And honestly, stress is my sneaky way into having any kind of conversations about a spiritual life.
Mm,
Yeah, because we're comfortable talking about it, and really we know when we're walking around in stress mode and stress culture and stress state, like everything feels clenched. It feels like we're holding our breath all the time. It feels like there's no space to actually then like explore what it
mm.
would mean to simply be present to this one life.
There's something I don't know if you've ever read the book, Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek, but there's a whole chapter devoted to kind of like the our body as a chemical
Mm.
drugstore in a way. So
Mm.
cortisol, for example,
Mhm.
cortisol is healthy in short bursts because
Right.
it basically spikes adrenaline, fight or flight. Are we going to choose to fight or flight in a stressful situation? But we also have dopamine, chasing goals, serotonin, which is a leadership I believe, chemical, feeling good about doing things for other people, being a
Mm.
servant leader, and then oxytocin, which is kind of like the love chemical. But
Yes.
we have to be able to create that blend within our life, because nowadays, I think, and it's so true, like in American society, Western culture in general, we're put more and more and more and more stressful situation. And I was writing a blog article yesterday. I think it's almost 4,000 ad advertisements that the average person encounters in a single day. So not including all the different stressors that you have in work,
Right.
within your
Right.
family. Now you have all these outside influences that are trying to create that scarcity mentality. You need to get this, you need to get that, you need to get this. And then we have this cortisol that's a slow drip, slow drip,
Mhm.
slow drip. And I truly believe, and that's one of my missions, is to end toxic leadership and try to end
Yeah.
that cortisol line, because cortisol will kill. If you
Yeah.
do not take that out of your life, that will literally create high blood pressure. It'll
Yeah.
create a heart attack, diabetes, all these different things. It leads to a deterioration of your health. So you have to be able to control that. And that
Right.
was very powerful. And I wanted to make sure that I went back and I highlighted that.
I love that. And that's the shorthand. That's my shorthand for stress is killing us.
Mm,
And it might also be keeping us from living our lives,
yeah.
right? And that's, I think, the crux of it.
So why is mindfulness so important to leaders? And then what is just one simple exercise, someone listening to a
Mm,
transformational leader like you, that
mm.
can apply it and lower stress in their lives today after listening to this?
John Kabat-Zinn has a great definition of mindfulness. He's like the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction, one of the kind of um, like arbiters of that work over the last several decades. And so this is my spin on what he says. Mindfulness is simply paying attention on
Mm,
purpose in the
mm,
present moment to the present moment without the filter of good, bad, right or wrong, judgment, story, anything. It's relating to life as it is. And so, from the perspective of managing stress, when we practice mindfulness, it allows us to learn to be with something like right on that edge of
yeah.
discomfort without needing to pounce, right? Every single time. And so when it comes to leadership, what a quality, right?
Mm,
To be able to be in this moment. What would that mean for any of us as people, as leaders? Does that mean we can listen? Does
mm,
that mean that we can actually be where we say we are instead of ordering groceries on our
yeah.
phone while we're in the meeting, you know? Does that mean that we could offer then like the deepest gift that we have to give in this lifetime, which is our attention, simply
Mm,
being with the people we're with, doing what we're doing. So I think it's key for leaders, for all of us, for stress, for any of it, for not missing this life, right? And it's something that I'm always trying to demystify meditation and mindfulness in my work because it's not like learning Latin or algebra.
yeah.
That's the good news, right? It's a remembering of our natural state. You know this, you have kids.
Mm,
Our kids come in utterly present, right? Utterly aware, captive,
yeah.
wide-eyed. That's who we are, right? That's who we are. And so it's a way to return. Let me think. What's the simplest? Oh, the simplest practice I know is a hand to the heart,
Mm,
right? And then you can feel the rise and the fall of your chest as you breathe. You can feel the thump, thump, thump of your heart. And if you can add a deep breath in and a deep breath out, and even close the eyes and just take in less of the distractions around you, it can be as simple as that. And they're
mhm,
tools that we have access to. We don't need an app. We don't need, it's like
yeah.
it's this breath and it's this breath. And it could be that one too. So,
I love that. And I use that almost every day. Like before I'll
yeah,
go into a major meeting or a presentation, it doesn't matter what it is. Like and this is how you know you care. Like my heart will just get fluttery. Like, okay,
good
it's time to go.
stress. Yeah.
Time, time to go, Josh. But
Yeah.
every time I'll do that, I'll on my own, I'll center myself, and I call it stop. So I'll silence my mind. I'll take a tactical pause, observe, and then pursue with purpose. But like at the end of the
Mm,
day, what I'm doing is I'm silencing my mind and just slowly practicing breathing. 3 seconds in,
mhm,
3 seconds out. And I'll do that until I feel my heart rate hit a steady state. And then that's when I know it's time to go execute. So I use
mhm.
that almost every day. And it's funny, if you would have talked to me 3 years ago, Josh, be like, nope, we're not doing that. We're going live.
Right.
But now I'm accepting that mindfulness is
Yeah.
a part of being a great leader, being, and you just said it, two perfect things: limiting distractions and
Mhm,
actively listening.
mhm.
If we could just do that, how great the world would be if we could
Yeah.
do those two things.
Oh, so good. So good.
So walk me through this stress school that you're working on
Mm.
right now. And you're also, are you working on a book?
I am.
Yeah.
Yes, I am. I'm working on a book about stress and stress culture and remembering our way back to who we really are. And Stress School is an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program that I developed
Mm,
that teaches those basic skills of practicing paying attention and awareness and layering in the breathing and relaxation response exercises that will help you get into the parasympathetic part of your nervous system, the rest and
mm,
relax and restore and the tend and befriend part of who we are. So it walks you through those skills over the course of 8 weeks, but also helps you take a really kind of Socratic method look into how stress is impacting your life, impacting your relationships, the choices you're making, and perhaps give you some information about, you know, next steps or
mm.
how you might want to rearrange some things in your life. We can't do it all in 8 weeks, but it's a great start. And really what it is about giving you the tools that you will train and practice together. And then, you'll use them for the rest of your life, which is
Yeah.
my unsexy promise.
I
It's
love that.
like none of this is like, okay, you're done, you graduated, you
Yeah.
figured it out, all of your stress is solved. It's like, no, we're just getting started. So,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
That is the same mindset that I have with leadership, is that
Mm,
leadership is a lifelong journey. It's not a destination. We don't achieve it when we take over a position or we get a new title or
yeah.
we have authority. It's continuous. It's throughout our entire lives. And I see it in 6 distinct phases, but I feel that so many people kind of going back to the Western culture, right? Oh, I'm cured. I'm going to go
Yeah.
back, and they just forget everything that they've learned because they've achieved that fulfillment, or how you like to say, I believe, that wholeness
Mhm.
in that moment, and then they totally forget everything they went, and they get back into the world, and then the world does the same thing, just bombards them and hits them with all these different distractions. So walk me through your podcast that you have too. What's the frequency with that? And then what is the layout? What do you provide to listeners?
I really wanted to start a podcast when COVID hit because I
Mm,
missed the experience of getting to sit in a real room with real people and
yeah.
teach and talk through these concepts and create the experience of pause and meditation. And it took me a while to get started. I mean, I had one young kid when COVID hit, and then we added another to the mix. And finally, when my youngest son, who's 1.5 now, was like 5 weeks old, I was like, I'm starting this podcast. And so when he napped, I would record the episodes. And so by
Wow.
design, it's always been me, just me, on the podcast, using it as a place to have conversations like we're having, except for I'm just
Mm,
talking to my people. And for most episodes, bring people through an experience of meditation, a
mm,
practice of meditation within the episode. So that's my way of hitting my mission of putting the tools of immediate stress relief in as many hands as possible. Like if you listen, you will have an experience of relaxation within the episode. And I structure the content around questions that my people are asking me about stress and stress culture. I actually had my first guest on, and it was my husband, and we were doing a part two to an episode that I put out about parenting stress.
Mm.
And it had a really big response. And so I brought my husband on to have a
Oh yeah.
conversation with me about parenting stress and communication and stress. And so it's really coming from my people asking questions and me being able to answer those questions in a large format context and
Mm.
always give people just like a tiny bit of peace, I hope, in a moment of the podcast. And I love it so much. It's so good. It's so much fun to be able to do that. Yeah.
Y- You remind me so much of, a good friend of mine, Brianna Greenspan. She's a co-author of the book of affirmations, A Miracle
Mm,
Morning, and
mm.
she believes in mindfulness meditation, but also just affirmation. So what I'm going to make sure that I do is connect you to, because I see some
Oh, thank
synergy
you.
there.
Thank you.
And she has such a very impactful mission too of kind of creating this movement of miracle morning savers within schools. So
Mm,
silence, affirmation, visualization, exercise, reading and scribing, but teaching it, which is essentially just a mindfulness tool to
yeah,
young children. Because if we can equip them early on, then they can go and fight these life's battles and be able to call, BS on something if it's not aligned with where they're trying to grow.
right. Oh, I love that. Thank you. Thank you for that. So good.
So, as we kind of get towards the end of this podcast, I want to go back full circle. What would
Mhm.
be one of the most impactful pieces of advice that you would give to someone just going in corporate law? Everything that you've learned so far, what could you give
Mm.
someone?
Pause. Pause, make sure you're doing that regularly. Rest in the margins, don't need to fill every space. It's so strange as a lawyer, you track your time down to the like every 4 minutes or whatever. And it's
Yeah.
like, this is this. I wrote a post about this once. I'll have to put it on the podcast. So the Greeks had two different kinds of time, chronos and kairos. And
Mm.
the software we used to track our time at my law firm was called Chronos.
Yeah.
And Chronos is like it's like the chronological time. It's the billable hour for the attorney. It's knowing that our meeting is at this time. But Kairos is when it's the time apart from time. It's the pause. It's the stepping
Mm.
outside to pay attention, to look around, to look within. And I think lawyering is a lot of Chronos. So make sure you're accessing that kairos, that sacred time too, even if it's just 5 minutes out of a day, your busiest day.
Rest in the margins. I don't think I've
Mhm.
ever heard that. And I'm now going to overuse that all the time. Rest in the
It's so
margins.
good. I think I got it from a New York Times article about rest, but it's just like, yeah, rest in the
Mm.
margins. Like, uh, you know, think about a book, the page of a book. If there were no margins, if there was no blank space, you couldn't gather any of that information. You couldn't take in any of that wisdom on the page.
So we're at our final show segment. These are the same 4 questions that I ask everyone on the Tales of Leadership podcast. You'll probably get a kick out of what I call it, but the killer bees. So be brief, be brilliant, be present, and then be gone. All right, you ready? Question one.
Yes.
All right. So what do you believe separates a good leader from an extraordinary leader?
Empathy, compassion, kindness, listening.
Mm, mm. All right, question two. And you've already provided a lot to this question, but what is one resource that you would recommend to our listeners?
Taking 5 minutes out of your day to sit with your hand on your heart and close your eyes and breathe. And if you can't sit, no problem. Take yourself for a walk without your devices. Just try starting 5 minutes a day. Yeah.
Mm. Question three. If you could give yourself when you were younger a piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh, dear one, be kinder. Be kinder to yourself. It's all happening and trust the timing of your life.
Hmm. So, the final question: how can our listeners find you and how can they add value to your mission?
Oh my goodness, that's a good one. You can visit me at katherinezack.com. You can find the podcast there. You can find ways to reach out to me directly there. Um, and on Instagram at Kath Zack. The podcast is called Beyond Balance, so you can find that anywhere you listen to your podcasts. I am, you know this, Josh. I am not great on LinkedIn. I am there, and you can find me. But if it takes
Yeah.
me a while to respond to you, I just haven't seen your message yet. I try to choose where I show up in terms
Mm,
of tech because otherwise it's too much stress for me. So
yeah.
go to the website. You can find a way to reach me directly there. And I'd love if people listen to this episode and want to check out Beyond Balance and share it if you happen to know anyone else, if you happen to know anyone who's stressed.
Yeah. It's no one in the world is stressed.
No one.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Catherine, this has been an amazing episode. Thank you for being intentional with me for this past hour and talking about one of my passions, which is leadership, and then talking about one of your passions too, I believe. This has been a great
Yeah.
episode.
Oh, you're the best. Thank you, Josh. Thank you. Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.